So three distinctive groups holding three distinctive emphases as part of what they thought it meant to follow Jesus. And then a cataclysmic event happened. Jerusalem is sacked and burned. The blood runs in the streets. The temple is destroyed. And the center of Judaism is wiped out. What this means is that the Jewish followers of Jesus whose lives centered around the temple, they were no longer a factor in what was going to happen for the rest of the first century. Maybe they were killed. With the destruction of the temple, there was a great shaking of faith amongst the Jewish people. What does this mean, and how are we to make sense of this? And in fact, that was the birth of a dispersed kind of Judaism that centered around synagogue life elsewhere, because Jews fled that land and they were dispersed throughout the world. That also affected the Galileans, in part because Galilee was a place where a lot of revolutionary ideas and a lot of revolutionary activities happened. And so when the Romans finally decided to bring the hammer down, they brought it down everywhere. And the people in Galilee also were affected, not by the destruction of Jerusalem, and by the impact of Roman occupation, and by the impact of this outflow of Jewish people from the city of Jerusalem now coming to the smaller towns and villages and taking over and setting up shop in the local synagogues. That's really when the Pharisees became the most dominant group in first century Judaism. Before the destruction of Jerusalem, they were a very minor group. But it's their increasing influence as they come to the towns and villages and in the dispersed areas of Palestine and beyond that they come into contact with the followers of Jesus who are also in those synagogues, and there's great friction between the two of them. They don't get along with each other. And that leads to the prominence of Pharisees in the Gospels. The group that survives, and survives most readily, are the Gentile followers of Jesus who have been shaped and formed and instructed by the ministry of Paul and other missionaries, and by the letters of Paul and letters of others that we don't have anymore, that taught them how to be followers of Jesus in a secular Greco-Roman world. In fact, it's Paul's letter to the Romans where Paul says, we don't have any beef with the emperor. The emperor has power in this world because God gives it to the emperor. And the emperor uses that power to keep order in the world. And that's the way it's supposed to be. And so that doesn't come into conflict with our Christian faith. And so throughout the entire realm, at least in the first century, Christians were okay. They were pretty much able to be all right and continue to grow and continue to get followers and continue to do the things that they knew how to do. So 70 comes, temple is destroyed, Jerusalem is destroyed, Israel, for all intents and purposes, is wiped out. There will be another revolution 40 or 50 years later that will be the final last gasp of Judaism in that land, but this was the crushing blow in 70. After that, you have pieces of the Christian movement everywhere. And they are disparate from one another. The contentions they had, the disagreements they had, those still linger in the air, but now they live in close proximity to one another. It's in that environment that the Gospels begin to be written down. And what is it that the Gospels do? They take the sayings and stories of miracles of Jesus. They demonstrate his continuity with all of the Jewish practices, his fulfillment of all of the Hebrew prophecies in the Old Testament. And they show how this Christian community was sent by Jesus to reach out to the entire world. And in fact, there are stories in the Gospels where Jesus has saving, constructive interaction with non-Jewish people. And so the Gospels bring together the stories and the important emphases of all three of these groups, and they put them together in one story of Jesus' life. They're not only a great example of writing, they are an example of the creation of a community around a set of texts. The first of these Gospels was Mark, somewhere maybe as early as the late 60s, most likely after 70, before 75. Somewhere in that range, the Gospel of Mark is written down. The Gospel of Mark is the shortest of the Gospels, and what's notable about the Gospel of Mark is that it's in a hurry. Everything is immediately in the Gospel of Mark. And that's because if Jesus has been crucified and resurrected, and now the temple is destroyed and Jerusalem has been sacked, the end is about here. There's no time to fool around. In fact, that's what Jesus says in the very first chapter of the Gospel of Mark when he announces himself and gives the theme for his ministry, as Mark will tell it to us. Behold, the time is at hand, time's up, because the realm of God is drawn near. So repent, turn completely away from everything you think you know and understand, and instead trust entirely in this good news. So the Gospel of Mark is in a hurry because it wants us to hear this, it wants us to respond because the time is coming. Maybe 15 years later, certainly by 90, maybe as early as 80, Matthew and Luke write down their Gospels. And when we say Luke's Gospel, we also have to include Acts because they originally circulated together. They were one long book. Matthew and Luke take Mark's Gospel as an outline. Matthew and Luke take what Mark has written down and they say, yeah, that's the order of events. They also take the Q document, so a collection of teachings and sayings, and say, these ought to be included. These are things Jesus said and did and taught, and these are important to be remembered, and they need to be included. Matthew and Luke also have their own original material that no one but them remembers. For example, the story of the prodigal son in Luke, it's the only place where we find it. Luke has his own sources for things, as does Matthew. And so when scholars sit down and they put those Gospels side by side, they can see, the story follows Mark's outline. They have Jesus saying the exact same things, even though they were written down in different places. They have Jesus saying the exact same things, and so they've borrowed from these sources. And here Matthew has something original about how the church is supposed to make its way in the world, and Luke has something original about forgiveness or grace or inclusion, and so they had their own sources. So we have what are called the Synoptic Gospels, and synoptic means seen together, and what that means is that Matthew, Mark, and Luke basically sound alike. There are minor differences between them in the way they tell the story and minor differences in the order of one thing or another, but in general, they follow a similar outline, so much so that when we study Mark or Matthew or Luke, it's hard for us to just read one gospel because all three of them have kind of smeared together in our heads, and all three of them have kind of smeared together in the way they've been taught. And then we got a whole different thing.